after a huge backlash around Kneecap and Bob Villan. The Culture Secretary Lisa Nandy earlier today announced in the Commons that the government is on a collision course with the BBC over its coverage and its editorial standards.
Outstanding questions remain, including why this performance was broadcast live, given the concerns regarding other acts in the weeks preceding the festival, why the feed wasn't immediately cut when the chants of death to the IDF began, and what due diligence was done prior to the decision to broadcast this particular act to the nation.
So is it right for government ministers and the Prime Minister himself to intervene in the BBC's editorial treatment? And if so, what might that punishment look like? Well, now the Telegraph is reporting this evening that the BBC Director General made the decision not to pull the live stream of Bob Villan's Glastonbury performance from iPlayer while attending the festival himself. The plot thickens. And to discuss this and dissect it, I'm delighted to say I'm joined in the studio by the former Attorney General Sir Michael Ellis, as well as my colleague, GBNews' senior political commentator Nigel Nelson. Sir Michael Ellis, let's start with you first. What's your take on the BBC's treatment of Glastonbury, and do you think it requires governmental intervention?
Not only do I think it requires governmental intervention, I think it requires heads to roll, Martin. I think this is a step too far. And frankly, I think it's time now for Tim Davie, as Director General of the BBC, to go. We cannot have the situation that we have now seen at Glastonbury being broadcast on our airwaves. You know, there are hundreds of thousands of Jewish people in this country who are obligated, like everybody else, to pay their licence fee. Can you imagine those Jewish people who are in this country who are required by law to pay the licence fee when the BBC are transmitting that type of material? Now, the fact is, they walked into this with their eyes wide open, it seems to me, both the Glastonbury organisation itself and the BBC. It's pretty rare, Martin, that you have both Kemi Badenoch and Keir Starmer agreeing on something. They both warned beforehand about Glastonbury. Those warnings were ignored, and now we are where we are.
So, Michael, if this report from the Telegraph is true, and that man, Tim Davie, the BBC Director General, made the decision himself not to pull the live stream of Bob Villan's performance while he was at the festival himself, is that the final piece for you of damning evidence?
Yes, it is. I think he really does have to go. The fact is, even if he was not there himself, even if he was so-called off-duty, the fact is, he is the head of the organisation. It's extremely easy. All broadcasters know, and I'm sure many people at home would imagine it's common sense. There is a cut-off switch that can be pressed. And if you are covering an event like Glastonbury, especially with all the pre-warnings about it, someone in the gallery there in the control room literally should have had their finger hovering over the cut-off button. This shouldn't have taken anybody by surprise. And if they were going to broadcast this stuff, they should have been ready to cut it off at very quick notice. To have made an active decision to broadcast it is outrageous.
And Sir Michael Ellis, what's of Glastonbury itself? Of course, they have a fallow year next year. They'll have to let their site have a rest. But should they lose their licence?
Well, I think they're in trouble. And I spoke just a short time ago to the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, a charity, a noted charity in this country. And they are planning to write to Glastonbury and to the local authorities who are responsible for what's called a premises licence, which is the events licence for such an event as Glastonbury, and challenge the continuation of that licence. And I can fully understand why that be the case, because this is an international event licensed with over 200,000 people to attend, and they have a responsibility to adhere to the standards that are required by that licence. And now this charity, the Campaign Against Anti-Semitism, is challenging that licence going forward. So Glastonbury is in real trouble.
Do you think the sad state of affairs, Sir Michael Ellis, is that we've had this conversation for so long now? There seems to be a collective mindset at the BBC itself of a pro-Palestine position,
yes,
a challenging position on Israel, and what we saw the weekend was the sad yet inevitable outcome of that.
I'm afraid that's right, and that's certainly the perception that many people do have. because this isn't the first time this has occurred or something similar to it has occurred. There have been other examples of this. And so there's understandable concern that the BBC is not a neutral party in this debate. And it's a tragedy for their own reputation, for those of us that care about the BBC as an institution. It's not in anybody's interests for that international reputation to be sullied by the fact that people don't feel they can believe their reporting on this topic. When it comes to the Middle East topics, there are many people who increasingly don't feel they can trust the BBC. And that surely is fatal when you're expected to pay a tax to receive that coverage.
So, Michael Ellis, withering stuff there. Let's bring you in, Nigel Nelson. If this Telegraph report is true, it's just a report, but if it's true, and the decision was placed with the head honcho himself, who didn't do that, that's damning evidence.
Yeah, I think that's extraordinary. I mean, I certainly think that what we needed to know is exactly what the procedures are at the BBC for pulling live coverage like that, which it should have been pulled. And if it was the Director General who said, no, don't pull it, no, that is extraordinary. What we should wait for...
Should he get the chop?
No, hang on. Before he gets the chop, I think you ought to go through the right process. The police are investigating. No charges have been brought yet. We wait to see if that process go all the way through.
It's not a police charge, though, is it? This is an editorial remit, George. You've worked in newspapers many, many years. If an editor made the decision to not pull a libelous or a dangerous story, the editor would get the high jump. What's the difference?
What I'm saying here is that the responsibility was for the BBC to pull the live coverage and pull it immediately. Offensive comments were made. I think that's what should have happened. Before we end up with the resignation of the Director General, let us see the case take its course and see what happens there.
Do you think that process? Well, let's look at all the evidence will be taken. For example, I don't know if GBNews had broadcast something that the Twitterati didn't like. Come on.
No, I think if GBNews had been broadcasting, then it wouldn't have been broadcast. That we'd have pulled the plug immediately.
You're actually correct on that. You are correct on that.
Except they ought to have now. They do
accept that. When Michael talks about the BBC being pro-Palestinian, I don't think that's true. And
that's a perception.
The other point there is the Israelis will not allow international journalists into Gaza, so it's very difficult to get independent reporting out of that.
No, but I think you still have to...
You might get killed in any war zone. You might have got killed in Afghanistan
even assuming that's correct, any journalist has a responsibility to broadcast factual information or write factual information, and if they can't stand something up, not to report or print it.
Israel also has an obligation to allow independent journalists to go into a war zone to see for themselves exactly what is going on.
I don't think they do, but that's a different subject. The reality
you can't report from something if you're not there.
The reality of the matter is they've been doing a lot of reporting, and their reporting is not trusted by a large number of people, and that's injurious to the BBC's reputation. And what we've been seeing in the last few days is sullying international relations, but it's also, perhaps most importantly, damaging community cohesion in this country. We're now seeing, I've seen reports today at other locations, other protests, some of these odious chants being repeated now in other places. So are we going to see this now, this message, this example being repeated? It's an appalling travesty for community cohesion in this country.
OK, so Michael Ellis, the former Attorney General, thank you very much for joining us, and also Nigel Nelson, thanks for your input. Now, regarding the Director General Tim Davie's involvement in the decision to keep the iPlayer live stream of Bob Villan up, GBNews has contacted the BBC for comment. But on the event itself, a BBC spokesperson said this. Some of the comments made during Bob Villan's performance were deeply offensive, and during this live stream on iPlayer, which reflected what was happening on stage, a warning was issued on screen about these very strong and discriminatory language. We have no plans to make the performance available on demand. Now, in a statement shared on Instagram on Sunday, the artist Bob Villan said this: teaching our children to speak up for the change they want and need is the only way that we make this world a better place. As we grow older and our fire starts to possibly dim under the suffocation of adult life and all its responsibilities, it's incredibly important that we encourage and inspire future generations to pick up the torch that was passed to us. So there we go. Well, thanks to Michael and to you, Nigel. Now,